Hey Drifters! While having been pushing progress on the upcoming definitive Parkour mod updates guide, I decided to take a short break and instead try out and analyze the brand new Shadows Eject update as deeply and thoroughly as possible, for my own sake, and to share my thoughts and observations, but especially certain suggestions I believe would greatly improve their reliability. Before getting into any of my thoughts or mechanical feedback, I want to preface with my appreciation for all the work that has been done to further an absolutely fundamental aspect of this game and franchise into a direction that has never been more promising. From the sole persistence in shaping the system into providing more functionality and control, to the very intent fueling it all, it's heartwarming to be taken into account and heard. On a gameplay level, it feels amazing to know I have access to so many more contexts and positions at any given moment, let alone through my single favorite mechanic in AC, if not gaming in general. The influence of the eject range and power on my gameplay is clear as day, and while I was initially skeptical about the crazy range, with how it allows for access to so many more destinations in Japan's non-parkour friendly geometry, I've grown to appreciate it. Sadly, despite all the positives, things are far from perfect in terms of eject triggering and targeting. And while I have a lot of feedback, it's all fueled by a strict wish to see this system improve. I especially have certain suggestions I believe would greatly improve their reliability. Many controller players have noticed how ejects of any strength target foot landings, if any, far more consistently when pointing their directional input slightly outward instead of exactly to the side. The main issue seems to be a combination of strong directional input rigidity and potentially a very sensitive destination validity check run while the game checks the eject's prescriptive targeting. As Shadows takes the directional input very rigidly, there are cases where pointing side ejects at exactly 90 degrees results in a hang landing, if not total execution failure. This seems to be due to the occasional existence of very minor geometric obstructions, sometimes as wide as only a couple centimeters, likely colliding with the destination validity check and determining the player wouldn't fit there even if they can with as much as a slight angular adjustment, no more than 10 to 15 degrees. I believe this is one of the reasons for dinos, aka climb leaps, often taking priority over ejects in contexts where the game deems no eject landing type as suitable. In this example, Now is unable to footline onto this destination when inputting to the side on keyboard and mouse due to this wooden support, but manages to make it at 45 degrees, and even a significantly smaller adjustment in this controller example also allows for a landing. In this case, attempting to side eject up to this set of crates fails to actuate in the first place, while a 45-degree input manages to target, although surprisingly with a hang. Same as last time, a slight angular adjustment on controller allows for a foot landing. What's interesting is that sometimes approaching the destination very closely before ejecting actually performs it, even extending the angle. It almost seems like this exclusively happens by brute forcing targeting into only one valid destination, where the inability to chain into a hang allows for existing angle increment systems to kick in. It's understandable that alterations to these collision checks might prove difficult to implement without affecting other important behavior, but if my theory stands, I suggest a different solution. While the game likely already checks for possible eject destinations in small, angular increments, it shouldn't stop at the first angle containing a valid destination, but continue scanning instead, until having reached its angle limit, 15 to 20 degrees for example. Only after finishing all checks, the game determines the best and most suitable destination based on distance, height, landing type, etc., only taking angular coherency as a minor parameter. I believe this would also aid other potential cases where fully perpendicular ejects fail to target. Despite having presented these angular increments exclusively iterating outward, ejects pointed diagonally or backwards would best work with scanning to both sides. It is simply important to limit scans from targeting further inward, beyond 90 degrees. Of course, the ideal would be to both readjust the destination check itself, as well as implement this angular leniency, but I can't know how plausible that is. This is particularly evident as a keyboard and mouse player, where there is no way of manually increasing targeting consistency by pointing further out, as it's only possible to point to the sides, 45 degrees diagonally or backwards. It might then be easy to simply ask for camera relativity on keyboard and mouse in order to return true omnidirectionality, but despite that being something I would personally adore, I don't believe simply having access to it is a valid solution, as no player should have to manually compensate for such scenarios regardless of input method. The reason for my mention of angles as wide as 20 degrees outward is also exactly the unavailability of fine angular control on keyboard and mouse. If this gets considered though, it might be worth looking into reducing this angle by 5 to 10 degrees on controller, as it already allows for finer control. Although far more lenient, I've come across a case or two where a similar issue might be happening with checks for whether the character's own trajectory collides with anything, also reacting to extremely small, ideally negligible geometric obstacles. Returning to my brief mention of limiting nod from targeting inward, there is a significant issue when playing with a controller where the game allows for directional input beyond 90 degrees by a massive amount. To clarify, not all cases of slight inward targeting necessarily harm the nature of side ejects. I believe it's generally acceptable at slight angles if it loses height or if it targets a tangibly separate object. The issue instead comes from cases of gaining height up to the very object the player is hanging from, looking rather wrong and defeating the point of parkour puzzling up to nearby objects. While I'm sure the team is doing its best to iron out cases of inappropriate inward ejects, I also concretely believe the input direction on controller would be best capped at 90 degrees with a dead zone beyond that clamps it back to 90. There is also undesirable behavior when attempting to perform side ejects by holding parkour up while pointing to the side. Instead of performing a side eject like the game normally would have, a different action always overrides its activation in a manner dependent on context. If done next to a destination that the player can free hang on, that is, hang with their feet suspended mid-air, the player instead strictly ejects into said hang when they could easily reach it with feet. If done next to a destination that the player cannot freely hang from, they instead climb along the wall or switch sides at edges, despite being able to perform an eject. It's somewhat possible to circumvent this issue by starting to spam parkour up, but even that can fail depending on rather unclear timing. I believe there are multiple ways to go about this, but one thing stands most important. Triggering the new, properly targeting ejects as the most powerful and utile move in most contexts should be consistently and easily accessible in all ejectable scenarios. The most basic suggestion that comes to mind would be to ensure that tapping parkour up, as opposed to holding, absolutely guarantees the new ejects to trigger when possible, with the ability to queue them up with a tap in the middle of wall runs or before landing in a hang. This would in turn help better differentiation between dyno and eject triggering, especially if tackling the aforementioned destination validation failure proves possible. Ideally, there could be an even more robust method of fully guaranteeing an eject done by holding a specific input down while attempting. Analogously to games containing high profile, it's easy to imagine Sprint serving that purpose in Shadows, but its default controller bind might make that unwieldy. Though unrelated to actual parkour functionality, I also have feedback on Nao's new twirly eject animation. While I believe it showcases her style and personality very well, genuinely looking very good when maintaining or losing height, I believe a different animation could be applied specifically when gaining height, as I don't think the current one communicates her pushing hard enough to reach her theoretical limits. If it were less twirly and showed Nao pushing off with her foot with more force for a bit longer, it would communicate a greater amount of effort, essentially saying, I really have to put my strength and focus into this one. I also believe the current animation tends to feel a bit slow when targeting very close destinations. When attempting to ensure as much consistency as possible upon ejecting, we often utilize climb cancels, that is, cancelling short climbs into ejects. This is generally useful in ensuring that the player doesn't perform a dyno or side switch animation which takes priority. This bit of feedback focuses on the side switch, where it would be very useful if they were cancelable into ejects, as these cases tend to prove themselves unwieldy, if not impossible. While not eject related, I have another suggestion I believe potentially plausible, as it relies on functionality already existent in the game. From the perspective of keyboard controls, running toward the edge of a surface while holding parkour down naturally causes a parkour down action, be it a hop down or a hang. On the other hand, holding parkour down when sprinting at a vaultable object expectedly guarantees a vault. As the game is now though, doing the same toward a vaultable object that happens to be located exactly on an edge instead simply stops the player. As a logical continuation, I think it would feel rather great to have them perform a vault to hang over the object instead, exactly like the more situational window exits. By doing so, consistent behavior is brought over to yet another context with the vault resulting in a hang, ensuring any follow-up is rather smooth, but the vault non-volatile. I do understand how this could pose an issue for default controller binds though, as the manual dive is bound to the same button there, likely being very volatile in the case of a player specifically intending to target a vault to hang. And so we've reached the end. I appreciate you taking your time to hear my thoughts and feedback, and again, to the studio, putting this much work and care into bringing the quality of movement back up. I certainly hope my analyses and theories are correct, or at the very least conducive to useful and insightful feedback.